In 1939, the United States Army ranked somewhere between 17th and 19th in the world. Depending on how you counted, it was smaller than Portugal's. 174,000 men, scattered across 120 posts, camps, and bases throughout the continental United States. Most of their equipment was obsolete. Their tanks were relics from the previous war, or training substitutes made of wood and canvas mounted on trucks. Their artillery was ancient. Their doctrine was largely theoretical, built on the lessons of 1918, and never tested against a modern enemy. Germany, at that same moment, had already put over 1 million soldiers into the field and was preparing to roll across Poland in a matter of days. Nobody in Berlin was paying close attention to Washington. That was not arrogance. It was a reasonable reading of the evidence. The Wehrmacht had been built, trained, and blooded over years of deliberate preparation. Its officer corps had spent a generation studying the failures of the last war and building something new. Its NCOs were professionals in the truest sense. Men who had been doing this for years, who knew their weapons, who understood tactics at the small unit level the way a carpenter understands wood. America had nothing comparable. The United States had spent the interwar period consciously, almost proudly, dismantling its military. Congress wanted it that way. The public wanted it that way. After the slaughter of 1917 and 1918, another European war was not America's problem. That was the settled position of an entire nation. General George Marshall became Army Chief of Staff in September 1939, the same week Germany invaded Poland. He inherited an institution that was, by any honest measure, not ready to fight anyone. He knew it. His staff knew it. The generals in Berlin, to the extent they thought about it at all, knew it too. What none of them knew, what nobody could have known in the autumn of 1939, Aziris, was how fast that was about to change. The scale of what happened next is difficult to absorb. In 1939, the active army had 174,000 men. By the end of the war, more than 16 million Americans had served in uniform across all branches. The army alone peaked at 8,300,000 personnel in the spring of 1945. That is not growth, that is transformation. That is a country reaching into itself and pulling out something that had never existed before. A mass citizen army, built from scratch in less than 4 years, while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war on opposite sides of the planet. The transformation that followed would be unlike anything the world had seen before, and the men who drove it had no idea yet what they were capable of becoming. The men who filled those ranks were not soldiers when they started. They were farmers from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and students from Georgia who had never held a rifle in their lives. They were drafted, processed, equipped, trained, shipped overseas, and sent into combat against an enemy that had been fighting professionally for years. The early results were exactly what you would expect when raw civilians meet veteran professionals on a battlefield. The early results were not good. But here is what the German High Command underestimated. They looked at the American soldier in 1942 and 1943 and saw what he was: untested, green, prone to the mistakes that only experience can cure. They did not see what he was becoming. They did not see the feedback loop that had been built into the American system, the brutal institutional honesty that forced every failure to become a lesson, every lesson to become a doctrine update. Every doctrine update to become the training of the next million men flowing through the pipeline. The German army was magnificent. It had been forged over years, its quality the product of professional culture and institutional memory accumulated across decades. But it was finite. Its experienced NCOs and officers were being consumed on the Eastern Front at a rate that could not be sustained. By 1944, the Wehrmacht that landed in Normandy was not the same Wehrmacht that had crushed France in 6 weeks. It was older, thinner, more tired, holding the line with men who were themselves replacements for replacements. The American army that arrived in Normandy in June 1944 was not the same army that had stumbled at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. It had been rebuilt, re-equipped, retrained, and re-led. The officers who had proven unable to keep up had been removed. The ones who remained had been tested in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, each campaign teaching lessons that were written up, distributed, and absorbed by units that had not yet seen combat. There is a moment in the study of this war where you start to understand that the American military's greatest weapon was not the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang or the logistics network that moved fuel and ammunition across a continent. Its greatest weapon was its capacity for institutional learning, the ability to take a defeat, dissect it without ego, and fix what was broken before the next engagement. Other armies did this. No army did it faster or at greater scale than the Americans did between 1942 and 1945. The German generals who wrote their memoirs after the war understood this in retrospect. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, who fought against American forces on the Western Front in 1944 and 1945, wrote about the Allied advance with a specificity and grudging respect that was notably different from the dismissive tone German officers had used about American soldiers 2 years earlier. He wrote about American logistics as something that had no equivalent in German experience. He wrote about the pace of the Allied advance in August 1944 with the clarity of a man who had watched, helpless, as an enemy he had once dismissed turned into something he could not stop. That transformation, from the 17th ranked army in the world to the force that broke the Wehrmacht in the West, is one of the most remarkable military stories of the 20th century. It did not happen because Americans were naturally better soldiers. It happened because of speed, the speed of learning, the speed of production, the speed of institutional adaptation, and the sheer, overwhelming speed with which a democracy, once it decided to fight, could convert its industrial and human resources into military power. None of that was visible in 1939, when 174,000 men were scattered across 120 posts, and Germany was getting ready to show the world what a real army looked like. The education was about to begin. For both sides, all of that potential meant nothing until it was tested. And the test, when it came, was brutal. The first time American ground forces met the German army in a serious engagement, the result was not close. February 14, 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Rommel's Africa Corps, reinforced by elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, struck the 2nd Corps of the United States Army along a front that the Americans were not properly defending. What followed over the next several days was a masterclass in the difference between a professional army with years of combat experience and a force that had been in the field for only a few months and had never faced anything like this. American units broke under pressure. Commanders lost contact with their subordinates. Armor and infantry failed to coordinate. Artillery was misused or not used at all. Soldiers who had trained for this moment discovered that training and reality were two different things, and the gap between them could be measured in lives. By the time the Germans halted their advance and pulled back, the United States had suffered approximately 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. Equipment losses were severe. 2 full tank destroyer battalions were effectively destroyed. The 168th Infantry Regiment was shattered. Rommel's own assessment, delivered in the clipped professional language of a general who had seen this many times before, was not flattering. American soldiers lacked tactical experience. Their junior leaders made predictable decisions that German veterans had learned to anticipate. Their response to pressure was slow. Their coordination between different arms, the integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support that was the foundation of modern combined arms warfare, was years behind what German units could do reflexively after 4 years of war. He was right about all of it. What happened in the weeks after Kasserine is the part that tends to get less attention. The American army did not explain away the defeat. It did not attribute the disaster to bad luck, difficult terrain, or superior German equipment. Though all of those factors were present, it looked at what had happened with a cold institutional eye and made decisions. General Lloyd Fredendall, the Second Corps commander whose leadership had contributed to the disaster, was relieved within days. His replacement was George Patton, who arrived at Second Corps headquarters and immediately communicated, through his presence and his orders, that what had just happened was not going to happen again. Patton's methods were not subtle. He imposed a strict discipline that his men resented and his officers found exhausting. He insisted on proper uniform, proper saluting, proper military bearing in rear areas and front lines alike. His critics, then and later, questioned whether spit-shined helmets won battles. Patton understood something his critics missed. He was not enforcing standards for their own sake. He was building the habit of obedience. He was creating the muscle memory of following orders under pressure so that when the orders came in combat, when the noise and fear and confusion made thinking difficult, the response would be automatic. The discipline was training in a form that reached parts of a soldier that rifle drills could not. What Kasserine revealed was a gap between what the American army was and what it was going to have to become. What Elgueta suggested, for the first time, was that the gap was closable. 6 weeks after Kasserine, Second Corps attacked at Elgueta. This time, when German armor came forward, the Americans held. They used their artillery correctly, positioning it to cover the approaches and registering fires in advance. When the 10th Panzer Division rolled into the valley, it ran into a coordinated defense that destroyed 60 German tanks before the attack was broken off. It was not a masterpiece of operational art, but it was competent, and competence at this stage was the point. The German assessment after Elgueta did not change overnight. German officers were not going to revise years of professional judgment based on one defensive engagement. But something had been noted. The Americans had learned from Kasserine. The speed of that learning, 6 weeks from catastrophic defeat to credible defense, was not what had been expected. A professional army absorbs its lessons over years of institutional culture. These Americans were absorbing theirs in weeks. What followed in Sicily in the summer of 1943 accelerated the revision. The American 7th Army, under Patton, covered ground at a pace that forced even skeptical German officers to take notice. Patton understood the operational level of war in a way that very few Allied commanders did. The level between tactics and strategy, where the tempo of advance, the selection of objectives, and the exploitation of breakthroughs determined whether a campaign succeeded or stalled. His drive across western Sicily and the race to Messina were conducted with an aggression and a speed that reminded some German observers of their own panzer operations from the early years of the war. They did not say so publicly, but the reports going back to German headquarters were different in tone from what had been written after Kasserine. In Italy, through the autumn and winter of 1943 and into 1944, American units learned the hardest kind of warfare, attritional fighting in terrain that favored the defender completely. The mountains and valleys of the Italian peninsula negated American advantages in mobility and firepower. Progress was measured in yards, in ridge lines, in towns that had to be cleared house by house. The losses were brutal. The conditions were miserable, but the American soldier who came out of the Italian campaign on the other side had learned things about small unit tactics, about patience under fire, about the management of fear over extended periods that could not be taught in training. He had earned those lessons in the hardest possible classroom. By the spring of 1944, the divisions that had fought through North Africa and the Mediterranean were not the same units that had broken at Kasserine. Their officers had been tested and sorted. The ones who could not perform under pressure had been removed. The ones who could were being given more responsibility. Their NCOs were veterans in the real sense of that word. Their junior enlisted soldiers had the particular quality that only combat experience creates, a kind of settled, watchful competence, the ability to read a situation and act without waiting to be told. The German commanders who would face these men in Normandy in June 1944 had access to intelligence reports about American performance in the Mediterranean. Some of them read those reports carefully. Some did not. Some looked at the early stumbling of 1942 and 1943 and concluded that Americans were fundamentally unsuited to European land warfare. Too individualistic, too soft, too dependent on material advantages to fight like professionals. Those commanders were about to receive an education of their own. Those commanders who dismissed the reports, who filed the early stumbling under a permanent conclusion. They were about to find out how wrong a professional judgment can be. The contempt was not invented. It was built on evidence. German professional soldiers in the early years of the war had a framework for understanding their enemies, and that framework was rooted in combat performance. The French army, which had been considered the finest in the world through most of the interwar period, had collapsed in 6 weeks in 1940. The British had fought better but had been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk. The Soviets had stumbled catastrophically in the first months of Barbarossa, losing millions of men and thousands of square miles of territory before they found their footing. Each of these enemies had been measured, found wanting in some essential way, and filed accordingly. When American forces first appeared in significant numbers in North Africa in late 1942, German intelligence produced assessments that placed them somewhere below the British. Less experienced, less professional, more dependent on equipment than on soldierly quality. Those assessments were based on the interwar record. America had no large-scale combat experience since 1918. Its peacetime army had been deliberately kept small and underfunded, and its soldiers came from a civilian society that German military culture viewed with a mixture of fascination and condescension. Wealthy, comfortable, technically capable, but not in the German professional understanding of the word warriors. The cultural dimension of this assessment matters because it shaped how German commanders approached their engagements with American forces throughout the campaign. If your enemy is fundamentally soft, then pressure will break him. If your enemy is fundamentally dependent on his equipment, then deny him the equipment and he will stop. If your enemy's soldiers are civilians in uniform rather than professionals, then destroy his junior leadership and his units will lose cohesion. These were the operating assumptions that German commanders carried into their engagements with Americans in 1942 and 1943. And for a while, those assumptions produced results. Kasserine Pass confirmed everything. American units buckled under the kind of pressure that German formations applied as a matter of routine. The coordination failures, the leadership failures, the collapse of units that had looked solid on paper. All of it fit the template. The after-action analysis in German headquarters noted American weaknesses with professional precision and concluded that the pattern would likely repeat. An army built this quickly, from a society this far removed from military culture, would need years to develop the qualities that the Wehrmacht had spent a generation cultivating. What the analysis missed was structural. It was comparing the wrong things. German military culture placed enormous value on what its theorists called Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. The idea that a junior officer, given a mission and an intent, should have the freedom and the training to figure out how to accomplish that mission without waiting for orders from above. The Wehrmacht's combat effectiveness at the unit level rested heavily on the quality of its NCOs and junior officers, men who had been selected for their judgment and trained to exercise it independently. This system was extraordinarily effective when those men were experienced veterans. It became fragile when they started dying faster than they could be replaced. The American system was different in ways that were easy to misread as weaknesses. American junior officers and NCOs were not products of a long professional culture. They had been trained quickly, promoted rapidly, and given authority that their German counterparts would have waited years to earn. The individual American soldier was famously independent. a quality that sometimes produced tactical disorder but also produced flexibility and initiative in situations where the plan had broken down. The American military's relationship to doctrine was pragmatic rather than doctrinal. If something wasn't working, you changed it. There was no institutional pride invested in a method that wasn't producing results. The contempt had been reasonable. The revision, when it came, would be forced on them one engagement at a time. This pragmatism was invisible from the outside. What was visible was the disorder. What was visible was the dependence on firepower and equipment rather than tactical finesse. What was visible was the American tendency to call in artillery or air support, when a German formation would have solved the problem with infantry. German officers wrote about this with a contempt that was genuinely professional. In their framework, the willingness to use firepower as a substitute for tactical skill was a sign of weakness, of an army that couldn't do the hard thing. They were misreading the situation entirely. The Americans were not using firepower as a substitute for tactical skill. They were using it because they had it, because it worked, and because in the calculus of war, the best way to win is to use the advantages you actually possess, rather than the ones your enemy respects. The American industrial machine was producing artillery shells, bombs, and aviation fuel at a rate that made lavish firepower support a permanent feature of American operations. German commanders who had spent their careers learning to fight effectively with limited resources genuinely could not adjust their thinking to account for an enemy who never seemed to run out of anything. There was also a specific quality to the individual American soldier that German officers noted but tended to minimize. American soldiers were, almost universally, literate. They came from a society with high educational standards, widespread mechanical aptitude, and the particular self-confidence of men who had grown up in a country that told them, and meant it, that their individual judgment had value. They could read maps, they could operate and maintain complex equipment, they could adapt to new weapons and new situations with a speed that consistently surprised their German counterparts. The American Army learned to drive tanks faster than the German Army had. It learned to operate its radio networks faster. It learned to integrate close air support with ground operations faster than anyone had expected. None of this was in the German assessments of 1942 and early 1943. Those assessments were built on what had been seen, and what had been seen was a Green Army making Green Army mistakes. The mistake was assuming that the Green Army was showing you its ceiling, when in fact it was showing you its floor. By late 1943, some German officers had begun to update their assessments. The performance in Sicily had been noted. The stubborn fighting in Italy was being filed differently. The reports coming back from units that had engaged American forces over an extended period had a different tone than the confident dismissals of 1942. The word that began to appear more frequently was not impressive or formidable. German professional culture did not produce compliments easily. The word was improving. And in the professional vocabulary of the Wehrmacht, that was the beginning of concern. June 6, 1944. 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel and came ashore on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. It was the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare, and nothing quite like it had ever been attempted before. The planning had taken 2 years. The logistical preparation was staggering in its complexity. And for all of that preparation, for all of the rehearsals and the intelligence work and the deception operations that had kept German attention focused on the wrong stretch of coastline, the outcome on the beaches themselves was decided by individual soldiers doing things that no amount of planning could guarantee. On Omaha Beach, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The word improving had entered the German professional vocabulary. What came next would make improving sound like a dramatic understatement. The preliminary bombardment missed its targets almost entirely. The bombers had released too late to avoid hitting the landing craft below, and the bombs fell inland, leaving the German defensive positions on the bluffs above the beach largely intact. The specialized tanks that were supposed to provide armored support for the infantry sank in the rough seas. 27 of the 32 D.D. Sherman tanks launched offshore went to the bottom before they reached the shore. The soldiers who made it to the beach found themselves exposed on an open stretch of sand with no cover, under fire from fortified positions on high ground that the preliminary bombardment had failed to destroy. The first waves were cut apart. What happened next is one of the defining moments in American military history, and it happened not because of a plan, but because of the men. Small groups of soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and privates acting without orders from above because there were no orders available, began to move. They found the draws, the low points in the bluffs, where the terrain offered some possibility of climbing. They improvised. They supported each other's movement with fire without being told to. They climbed. By the middle of the afternoon, soldiers were on top of the bluffs, attacking the German positions from above and behind, and the German defense of Omaha Beach was unraveling. General Omar Bradley, watching from offshore and receiving the casualty reports, had considered abandoning the Omaha beachhead and redirecting forces to other beaches. The men on the ground made that decision unnecessary. They solved the problem themselves at terrible cost, with exactly the kind of individual initiative and tactical adaptability that the German assessments of 1942 had said American soldiers lacked. The German commanders responsible for defending Normandy had intelligence that the invasion was coming. They did not know precisely where or when, and the Allied deception operations had done their work effectively. Many senior German commanders still believed, even after the landings had begun, that Normandy was a diversion and the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. But the defenders on the ground at Omaha knew what they were facing. They were in fortified positions. They had fields of fire that should have made the beach impassable. They watched the American landing craft come in and began to calculate, with professional accuracy, how long it would take to destroy the men coming ashore. They were wrong in their calculations, not because their position was weak. It wasn't, not because their fire was ineffective. In the first hours, it was devastating. They were wrong because they did not account for what American soldiers would do when the plan was gone and the situation was desperate. They did not account for the fact that the men who had volunteered or been drafted into this army had been told from the first day of training that individual initiative was expected of them, that a soldier who saw an opportunity and did not act on it was failing as much as one who ran from the enemy. That quality, the particular American willingness to act without being told, was invisible in the German intelligence files. On Utah Beach, the landings went better. The current had carried the first waves off course, depositing them in a sector of the beach that turned out to be less heavily defended than the planned landing zone. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the only general officer to land in the first wave at Utah, assessed the situation on the ground and made a decision that became famous. "We'll start the war from right here." He redirected the subsequent waves to the new landing point, improvising on the fly in a way that turned an accident into an advantage. Within hours, Utah Beach was secure, and American forces were moving inland. In the British and Canadian sectors, the fighting was different in character but similar in its essential quality. Allied soldiers, at every level from private to general, were demonstrating an adaptability that the German defensive plan had not fully accounted for. The plan had been built on the assumption that the attacking force would behave predictably, following its orders in a way that the defense could anticipate and respond to. The attacking force did not behave predictably. It improvised. It found gaps. It kept moving even when movement seemed impossible. The German response to the landings was hampered by command failures that had been baked into the defensive structure months earlier. The dispute between Rommel and von Rundstedt over where to station the armored reserves had resulted in a compromise that pleased neither man and served neither strategy. The panzer divisions that might have driven the Allies back into the sea were held back, waiting for Hitler's authorization, which did not come until afternoon when the window for a decisive counterattack had already closed. By the time German armor was moving toward the beaches, Allied air power was turning every road into a gauntlet. Columns that should have taken hours were taking days. What the German commanders wrote in their reports that night and in the days that followed was not complimentary about American soldiers in any direct sense. German professional culture did not produce compliments easily, but the assessments had changed in one important way from what had been written after Kasserine 16 months earlier. The word improving had been replaced by something more serious. American forces had landed on a heavily defended coast, absorbed catastrophic losses in the first hours, and kept coming. They had improvised under fire in ways that overmatched prepared defenses. They had shown, in the particular language of military professionals, that they could be hurt without being stopped. That was the beginning of a different kind of respect. The bocage had been solved. The lines had broken. Now the question was whether the American machine could turn a breakthrough into something that would end the war in the West. The revision did not come all at once. Professional assessments rarely do. What happened in the weeks after the Normandy landings was a slow accumulation of evidence that forced German officers to update, one engagement at a time, the conclusions they had reached about American soldiers. The bocage country of Normandy was the first and most brutal test. The hedgerow terrain, thick earthen banks covered with dense vegetation, built up over centuries as field boundaries, created a tactical environment unlike anything American soldiers had trained for. Each hedgerow was a natural fortification. Each field was a killing ground. The German defenders had prepared positions behind every row of vegetation, creating a layered defense that turned every few hundred yards of advance into a separate battle. Movement was measured not in miles, but in fields. Tank infantry coordination, which American forces had been developing through North Africa and Italy, had to be reinvented almost from scratch for this specific terrain. The early American attempts to break through the bocage were costly and largely ineffective. Standard tactics did not work. Tanks trying to climb the hedgerows exposed their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank fire. Infantry trying to advance across open fields ran into interlocking machine gun positions. German defenders who had dug in on the reverse slopes of the earthen banks were effectively invisible until American soldiers were almost on top of them. German commanders observing this noted it with professional satisfaction. The bocage had neutralized American advantages in firepower and mobility. Here, quality of the individual soldier, fieldcraft, patience, the ability to operate in close terrain without air support or artillery preparation, would determine the outcome. The assessment in German headquarters was that American units would stall in the bocage, ground down by attrition without the ability to bring their material advantages to bear. What happened instead was characteristic and should not have been surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. American sergeants and junior officers began experimenting with solutions. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had the idea of welding steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks. The teeth allowed the tanks to cut through the base of the hedgerows rather than climbing over them, eliminating the belly exposure problem and allowing armor and infantry to advance together through the vegetation. Within days of the first tests, General Bradley had ordered the modification applied to 3 out of every 5 tanks in the First Army. Within 2 weeks, the modified tanks, quickly nicknamed Rhinos, were in service throughout the attacking force. This was not a solution that came from headquarters. It came from a sergeant who looked at a problem, thought about it, and improvised a fix using materials that were lying around on the beach. The institutional response, rapid testing, rapid approval, rapid production, rapid distribution, was equally characteristic. The American military's ability to identify a working solution and scale it up across an entire army in days was something German commanders simply did not have equivalent capability for. Bayerlein had seen it up close. What was coming next across the wider front would make his experience in the bocage look like a preview. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best-equipped and best-trained armored divisions in the German army, wrote after the war about his experience fighting American forces in Normandy with a specificity that is worth examining. He noted that while American tactical technique in the early days of the campaign had been inferior to his expectations for an army with their equipment and numbers, the rate of improvement was unprecedented in his experience. Panzer Lehr was engaging soldiers in July who were substantially more effective than the soldiers who had landed in June. In a matter of weeks, American units had adapted to the bocage, developed new tactics, and were fighting with a coherence and aggression that bore little resemblance to the early stumbling. Bayerlein was describing something real. The American military's feedback loop between combat experience and unit-level training was operating at a speed he had not encountered before. Lessons learned in one regiment were being shared across the division within days. Techniques developed in one sector were being taught to units in other sectors before those units had even engaged the enemy. The German equivalent process, moving information from the front to the training establishment and back to new units, was slower, more hierarchical, more dependent on the experience of individual officers who had been doing this for years. By mid-July, General Bradley was ready to attempt the breakout operation that would end the stalemate in the bocage. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, was preceded by a massive carpet bombing of the German defensive lines, the largest tactical air attack ever undertaken in support of a ground operation. The bombing was not perfectly executed. Bombs fell short on 2 separate days and killed American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The tragedy was acknowledged. The operation went ahead. When the ground forces moved through the gap that the bombing had torn in the German lines, what followed was one of the fastest operational advances in the history of land warfare. The German defensive structure west of Saint-Lô simply ceased to exist. Units that had been ordered to hold their positions had been atomized by the bombing. The survivors were dazed, disorganized, cut off from their headquarters. Into this gap, Patton's newly activated Third Army poured at a speed that left German commanders struggling to understand what was happening. German General Paul Hauser, commanding the Seventh Army, wrote in his after-action assessment that the American exploitation of the Cobra breakthrough represented something qualitatively different from what he had observed in earlier American operations. The combination of air-ground coordination, armored speed, and aggressive junior leadership that Patton's forces displayed in the days after Cobra was, in his assessment, fully comparable to the operational technique that the Wehrmacht had used in its own great armored offensives in the early years of the war. He was not offering a compliment. He was making a professional judgment. And professional judgments from officers of Hauser's experience and reputation, delivered in internal military documents not intended for public consumption, are more reliable than almost anything else the historical record can offer. The assessment had changed. The question now was what to do about it. There is a moment in George Patton's career that the German High Command could not ignore. August 1st, 1944. Third Army activated. Patton in command. What followed over the next 14 days was an advance that covered 300 miles, from the breakout at Avranches through Brittany and then east in a sweeping arc that threatened to cut off the entire German force in Normandy. Patton's staff was working 18-hour days. His corps and division commanders were being given objectives that seemed impossible and somehow kept achieving them. His soldiers were moving so fast that they were outrunning their own supply lines, capturing fuel from German depots to keep the tanks rolling when the American supply chain fell behind. Patton's army was moving, and the German system, built for professionals fighting professionals at a measured tempo, had no answer for what was about to happen. German headquarters could barely track where Third Army was. The maps were obsolete before they could be updated. Columns that should have been held up by rearguard actions were bypassing resistance and continuing to advance. Units that attempted to establish defensive lines found Patton's forces had gone around them before the lines were complete. The operational tempo, the speed at which Third Army was making decisions and acting on them, was faster than the German system could respond to. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West in early July, sent a message to Hitler on August 21st that is one of the more remarkable documents to come out of the Western campaign. Von Kluge had commanded on the Eastern Front for years, had seen what Soviet forces could do when they had the initiative, had measured his judgment against some of the most difficult fighting conditions of the war. His message described the American armored advance with a specificity that reflects genuine professional assessment rather than defeatism. The enemy had demonstrated an operational mobility that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht could match with its current resources, and the situation in Normandy had become irrecoverable. Von Kluge was relieved by Hitler the following day, suspected of involvement in the July 20th assassination plot. He committed suicide during his drive back to Germany. His assessment was correct. The Falaise Pocket, the encirclement of the German 7th Army and elements of 5 panzer divisions in the last days of August, was the operational consequence of Patton's advance. American, British, Canadian and Polish forces closed a trap around approximately 100,000 German soldiers. Approximately 50,000 were captured. 10,000 were killed. The equipment losses, tanks, artillery, vehicles, were catastrophic and largely irreplaceable at this stage of the war. The remnants of what had been the Wehrmacht's primary force in the West escaped through a gap in the encirclement, but they escaped without their heavy equipment, without their unit integrity, and without the ability to mount serious resistance for weeks. German soldiers who came through the Falaise Pocket wrote about the experience with a horror that has no equivalent in the records of earlier campaigns. The road through the pocket was blocked for miles by destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of men who had not made it out. General Eisenhower, flying over the area after the fighting was over, wrote in his memoir that it was unquestionably the most ghastly scene he had ever witnessed. German survivors described columns of men walking east in a daze, without weapons, without unit organization, past the wreckage of an army that had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The officers responsible for this outcome were, in several cases, the same officers who had written the assessments of American soldiers in 1942 and 1943. They had made their professional judgments based on what they observed. They had observed weakness, inexperience, and excessive dependence on material advantages. They had concluded that American soldiers were not, in the fundamental sense, comparable to German professionals. What they had not accounted for was the specific quality of the American military's officer development system. The men who were commanding American corps and divisions in August 1944 were not the men who had been commanding those formations 18 months earlier. They had been tested, evaluated, and in many cases replaced. Bradley had relieved dozens of generals in the course of the campaign, officers who were competent administrators but who proved, under fire, unable to maintain the operational tempo that American doctrine now demanded. The generals who survived that selection process were the ones who could operate at patent speed, who could make decisions with incomplete information, who could communicate intent clearly enough that their subordinates could act without waiting for the next order. Patton himself was the most visible example of a quality that ran through the American system in 1944 at every level of command. He believed, and had written extensively before the war, that the fundamental requirement of a military commander was the willingness to act, not to plan perfectly, not to wait for certainty, to act on the best available information at the highest possible speed and then adapt as the situation developed. His tactical doctrine was built around the idea that a fast, imperfect decision executed immediately was almost always better than a slower, more considered decision that arrived too late. German officers who studied Patton's campaigns, and many of them did, before and after the war, recognized in his methods something that had echoes of their own best commanders, the willingness to pursue a breakthrough to exploitation before the enemy could recover, the insistence on maintaining momentum even when the flanks were exposed and the supply situation was precarious, the treatment of every tactical success as the starting point for the next phase, not as a position to be consolidated and defended. But Patton was not an anomaly. He was an expression of something systemic. The Third Army's division commanders were operating with the same philosophy. Their regimental commanders were operating with it. Their battalion commanders had absorbed it through the specific culture that the American military had developed over 3 years of war. A culture that valued speed, improvisation, and forward momentum in a way that was different from the more methodical approach that the British employed, and different in a different way from the attrition-focused grinding that characterized Soviet operations. The German officers who encountered Third Army in August 1944 were not encountering rookies. They were encountering an army that had taken everything the Wehrmacht had to teach about mobile warfare and added to it the one thing that German professional culture had never quite accounted for: the particular energy of men who believed they were winning, who had the material to sustain that belief, and who had learned, through 30 months of increasingly difficult combat, exactly how to turn that energy into decisive military results. Patton's name went into the German assessments with a permanent entry. France was gone. The army that had been assembled to hold it was shattered, and the men responsible for both outcomes were now being forced to confront exactly what they had spent 2 years refusing to believe. By August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. American soldiers walked down the Champs-Élysées past crowds that seemed to materialize from everywhere at once. People who had been hiding for 4 years emerging into the sunlight of a city that had been occupied since June 1940. General Charles de Gaulle led the march. The photographs from that day show American soldiers looking, in many cases, slightly bewildered by the emotion around them. They were young men from places where Paris was an idea rather than a reality, and suddenly they were in the middle of the idea, and it was real, and they had helped make it happen. The German commanders who observed this, from maps, from intelligence reports, from the testimony of retreating soldiers, were processing the implications of what had happened in the previous 8 weeks. In 8 weeks, the Wehrmacht had lost France. Not gradually. Not in a fighting withdrawal that preserved formations and equipment and the ability to reconstitute. It had lost France in a military collapse that consumed the Seventh Army, gutted multiple panzer divisions, and produced a defeat of a scale and character that German professional officers had not experienced since Stalingrad. And even Stalingrad had been a symmetric catastrophe, 2 exhausted giants grinding each other down. This had been different. This had been an enemy that got faster as the campaign progressed, that used its material advantages with increasing sophistication, that produced commanders at every level capable of maintaining operational tempo under conditions of maximum confusion. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps through the Normandy campaign and its disastrous conclusion, said after the war that the American army he faced in August 1944 was not the American army he had expected to face. He had been told, and his own early experience had confirmed, that American soldiers fought from their vehicles and from their supply chains, that without air support and artillery they were manageable. What he encountered in the hedgerows and at the Falaise Gap and in the pursuit across France was something different. Individual American soldiers and small units demonstrated a stubbornness under pressure that he had not anticipated. Units that should have broken under armored counterattack held. Officers who should have waited for orders to be clarified instead attacked. The specific quality he described, and he described it as something that surprised him, was the American soldiers' refusal to accept that a situation was hopeless. That quality is not teachable in the conventional sense. It emerges from culture, from the specific stories a society tells about itself, from the particular expectations that a training system builds into its soldiers. The American military in 1944 was producing soldiers who had been told from the first day of basic training that the man next to you was counting on you and that counting on each other was what made the difference. The unit cohesion that resulted was different from German unit cohesion, which was built on professional identity and the authority of experienced leaders. American cohesion was built on something more horizontal, a relationship between equals who had chosen to be there together, reinforced by the particular democracy of shared danger. On the German side, by the autumn of 1944, the situation had reached a point where professional assessments of American quality were almost beside the point. The Wehrmacht in the West was rebuilding from the catastrophe of August. Replacements were coming forward, younger, less experienced, poorly equipped compared to what had been lost. The officer corps was thinner than it had been at any point in the war. The NCOs, who had been the backbone of the German tactical system, the experienced veterans of the Eastern Front who had been transferred west to stiffen the Normandy defenses, had largely been killed, captured, or scattered. The assessments that German headquarters was producing in September 1944 about American soldiers were written by men who were looking at the problem from an increasingly desperate position. Some of those assessments were honest. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who would command the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes offensive in December, wrote about American tactical technique in terms that would have been unrecognizable in the assessments of 1942. He noted the speed and flexibility of American armored operations, the quality of American artillery support, and the specific competence of American logistics. The ability to keep a fast-moving army supplied with fuel, ammunition, and food in a way that German forces had never managed even in their most successful operations. He also noted something more specific, the quality of American battlefield decision-making at the junior level. The company commanders and battalion commanders who were fighting American units in 1944 were, in his assessment, operating with a tactical sophistication that reflected not just training but genuine experience, absorbed through the specific process of learning from failure that the American military had built into its operational culture. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was Germany's last serious offensive in the West. The planning was sophisticated. The tactical surprise was real. American intelligence had failed to detect the buildup, and the initial German advance caught American units in an unprepared defensive posture. For the first several days of the offensive, the German penetration was substantial, and there were moments when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. What stopped it was, in part, the extraordinary response of American units that had been caught off guard and were fighting without full information about what was happening around them. The 101st Airborne Division's defense of Bastogne, surrounded, outnumbered, without adequate winter equipment or sufficient artillery ammunition, became one of the defining episodes of the American military experience in Europe. Not because it was a great operational victory, but because of the specific quality it demonstrated. When the German commander sent a formal demand for surrender, the American commander replied with a single word: nuts. The 101st held Bastogne until Patton's Third Army broke through the encirclement from the south, completing one of the most impressive operational pivots in the history of armored warfare, an entire army changing its axis of advance by 90 degrees in winter in less than 72 hours. German commanders who observed the Bastogne defense and the Third Army relief operation wrote about both with something that had not appeared in their earlier assessments. The word, or something equivalent to it in German military prose, was respect. Not admiration, not affection. The language was still professional, still measured. But the baseline assumption had changed. The American army was no longer being evaluated against the standard of what an inexperienced force might be expected to do. It was being evaluated against the highest standards of military professionalism. And against those standards, in the winter of 1944 and 1945, it was measuring up. The last offensive had failed. The files were being closed. What remained was the record. and the record said something that German professional culture had spent 3 years resisting. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the American army began the process of capturing not just territory and prisoners, but documents. The intelligence files of the Wehrmacht's Western commands, the operational assessments, the after-action reports, the intelligence summaries, the private correspondence of generals, were collected, translated, and studied. What they revealed, in aggregate, was a portrait of an institution's forced revision of its most fundamental assumptions. The early files from 1942 and the first half of 1943 read as expected. Assessments of American soldiers as inexperienced, dependent on material support, prone to tactical error, unlikely to improve quickly enough to pose a serious professional challenge. These were the documents of confident professionals looking at an amateur force and concluding that professionalism would tell. The conclusions were not unreasonable given the evidence available at the time. The later files, from 1944 and early 1945, are different documents. Not in form, which remains the clipped, precise language of German military bureaucracy. Different in substance. The assumptions have changed, the baselines have shifted. The qualities that had been identified as weaknesses in 1942 have either disappeared from the assessments or been reinterpreted. The qualities that German officers had considered uniquely German, operational speed, flexibility under pressure, effective combined arms coordination, appear in the 1944 files as qualities that American forces had demonstrated, sometimes to a degree that exceeded what German units were achieving with similar assets. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army on the Western Front in 1944 and 1945, was captured by American forces in May 1945. He subsequently spent more than 2 years in Allied captivity before emigrating to South Africa. In the years after the war, he wrote extensively about his experiences, including his observations of American military performance. His assessments are worth examining in detail, not because he became an admirer of the American military. His professional culture was too different for that. But because he was an honest professional who looked at what he had seen and reported it accurately. Von Mellenthin wrote about the Allied logistics apparatus with a specificity that reflects genuine professional envy. The American ability to supply a fast-moving army across the distances involved in the 1944 campaign, keeping fuel, ammunition, food and replacements flowing to divisions that were advancing 50 miles a day, was, in his assessment, the most significant single operational capability that the Allies possessed. It was not a glamorous capability. It did not produce the dramatic images of tanks advancing or aircraft bombing. But it was the capability that made everything else possible, and it was a capability that the Wehrmacht had never come close to matching even in its most successful campaigns. He also wrote about the American soldier's relationship to his equipment with a specificity that illuminates something important. German soldiers, in his experience, were trained to master their assigned weapons and vehicles. They understood them deeply, could maintain them under difficult conditions, and fought with them with the confidence of genuine expertise. American soldiers, in his observation, had a different relationship to technology. They approached new equipment with a pragmatic curiosity, not as something to be mastered and perfected, but as a problem to be solved. They were faster to improvise modifications, faster to identify limitations and work around them, faster to combine different systems in ways that the original designers had not anticipated. The Rhino tanks in the Bocage were one example. The improvised armored recovery vehicles that kept American tank units operational at a rate German units envied were another. This quality, the American soldier as a practical problem solver rather than a professional craftsman, was something that German military culture did not fully have a category for. The Wehrmacht valued expertise, experience, and the authority of those who had proven their professional quality over years of service. American military culture valued results. The question was not how long you had been doing it or how perfectly you could do it by the book. The question was whether it worked. If it worked, you kept doing it. If it didn't, you changed it, and you changed it fast, and you didn't need permission from someone 3 levels above you in the hierarchy to make the change. The intersection of these two approaches, German operational and tactical sophistication, meeting American pragmatic flexibility and overwhelming material superiority, is what defined the Western campaign of 1944 and 1945. The Germans were often tactically superior at the unit level. Their anti-tank capability remained formidable to the end. Their defensive performance in the closing months of the war, conducted by an army that was by this point desperately short of everything, was in many ways more impressive than their offensive operations at the height of their power, simply because it required more from less. But it was not enough. Because the American army that was applying the pressure in those final months was not the same entity that had stumbled at Kasserine 26 months earlier. It had been transformed through a process of accelerated institutional learning that had no equivalent in the history of modern warfare into something that German professional soldiers ultimately had no adequate framework for assessing. It was too big. It was too fast. It learned too quickly. It never ran out of anything. And its individual soldiers, drawn from a society that had no warrior class and no military tradition in the European sense, fought with a stubborn effectiveness that the German assessments had consistently underestimated at every stage of the war. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at German Supreme Headquarters, signed the instrument of German surrender on May 7, 1945, at Rennes, France. The American officer present at the signing was General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff. Eisenhower himself did not attend. He sent a message to the combined Chiefs of Staff that was characteristic of the man, brief, direct, and without theatrical flourish. The mission was accomplished. The distance between 174,000 men scattered across 120 posts in 1939 and the force that received Germany's unconditional surrender in 1945 is one of the great journeys in military history. It was not a journey without cost. 407,000 Americans died in the Second World War. Another 600,000 were wounded. The men who made that journey, who transformed from the civilians they had been into the soldiers they became, paid for every lesson they learned. What the German files said in the end was this: the army they had dismissed, the army they had measured against professional standards it could not yet meet, had become something they had no name for. It was not a German army. It was not a British army. It was something new. Built by a democracy in a hurry. Forged in the specific fire of a war it had not wanted to fight, and shaped by the particular qualities of a society that had always believed, sometimes naively and sometimes correctly, that it could figure out how to do anything if it tried hard enough. The German professionals had not believed that. They were wrong.